1949, about 3% of the gross domestic product, which, by the way, has nothing to do with welfare. GDP is not GDW. It's not gross domestic welfare. It's gross domestic product. It happens to be statistically correlated with a lot of things that people want. For example, that their own children be better off than they are. But if you look at the GDP and try to say what percentage of it goes to exhaustible natural resources, in 1949 it was about 3. Now, if the demand for those resources is as Josh and Gary are suggesting, stand in more or less a fixed relationship to the GDP, so that we double our GDP, we double the consumption of those scarce resources, then wouldn't you think that their prices would rise and they would start to, we would expect them to have a larger and larger share of GDP? What do you think that they are now in 2008? Answer, they're about 1.5% of GDP, about half of what they were in 1949. Now, the economist's job is not to tell people what to think. It's not to tell people how to live. It is not to tell people that they would benefit from having this kind of life or that kind of life, or consuming more iPads and more food, or less environmental amenities, or what have you. The job of an economist is basically to tell people about trade-offs. That's what we do at work. We say that, look, if you're going to sacrifice this amount of growth, what you're going to get is this amount of improvement in the environmental metrics that we're concerned with. One of which is global warming. But the problem is that growth will go on whether Josh and Gary want it to or not. So if we try to give up some of our GDP so that people benefit later from the fact that the world didn't get as hot, during that time those people are going to increase their own well-being through their own choices of growth. Saving, investing, making their children better off than they were. As a result, there's no possibility that any attempt to help a Bangladeshi, for example, okay, in 100 years, stave off the water that's going to come and flood his hut. There's no possibility. Why? Because if you look at the growth that's happened in the economy, and these guys notwithstanding, it is not going to end. What will happen to the people in Bangladesh is what's happened to everybody else in the world. They've grown. We increased our GDP 9 times per capita since 2000, between 2000 and 1900. These people do exactly the same thing. They will do exactly the same thing. So by the time we get to 2100, you're going to be asking people, aren't you happy that we sacrificed at the beginning of the 21st century so that you guys could be better off? You know what they'll say? You know what the Bangladeshi driving his BMW will say? They'll say, why did you think it was important to help me when you wouldn't help my grandfather who was starving to death? So the priorities, people, it's the priorities. It's that we don't have enough money to be able to solve all the problems that the economies, developing and less developed economies have. But growth will fix a lot of those problems. It will fix a lot of those problems, not because economists say that it's good. I have a slide here that shows a bunch of slackers hanging out, not doing anything. And one thing that they are going to benefit from is economic growth, because no matter what they're doing, no matter how little, even the people that go on VPR and say, I live without a refrigerator, even those people, that's awesome if they live without a refrigerator, okay? And so even those people are going to benefit from growth because they will have to spend less time, okay, thinking about how to reproduce themselves, how to get food and clothing, the biological necessities. Finally, last point, and then I'll quit. You can't stop growth in the United States. You will not stop growth in the United States, no matter what happens. And thank God, because the very growth that's required in the developing countries is going to be a product of the demand for their exports that the United States and other developed countries gives them. Without free trade, without the ability of those people to satisfy our demand, what you're doing when you say no growth, you're not saying live simply so that others can simply live. You're saying live simply so that others will simply die. That's it.
Your lavalier mic over there is right there. Where? Okay, if you have a question, come down here. Please step forward if you have a question and ask them. There we go. While we're waiting, Gainesville has an announcement.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for coming, everybody. I'm calling it the Rumble in the Econ Jungle. It's pretty exciting. It's part of the Vermont New Economy Series, which is sponsored by the New Economics Institute, the Cooperative Development Institute, and the Inter-Residence Association. So I'm sure a lot of you have questions, I can tell. And it's important to ask these questions and build from it. Because, it's very easy to do nothing. But, the turnout we have today show that that's not the way of Vermont. That's not the way of UVM. The harder thing to do is to challenge our assumptions. And I say this to the neoclassical folks and the ecological folks. So if you want to try and build from this towards a new economy or the same economy, we've got two opportunities for you. The first is tomorrow. From 11 to 3, students from the divestment group of UVM will be talking about the endowment, social justice, and we'll be dyeing our vest shirts. So it's going to be a lot of fun to learn more about the event on Saturday, owning the new economy. We're going to get into different realms of economic thought like cooperative structures, alternate means of measuring value, clean energy, financing the new economy, divestment / responsible investment. But don't be worried, you neoclassical folks. We're also bringing a speaker there who thinks that alternatives in green tech is the key to global economic expansion. So you guys should all go, learn from it, and by the way, free lunch provided by Feelgood. Pretty much a no-brainer to stop by the summit. Check it out at vtneweconomy.org before you go to MGMT, and then it's pretty much the perfect day. Thank you.
Let's hear our first question, and try to keep the questions short so that the answers can be complete and we can hear a lot of different people. Go.
So my question is addressed to Bill and Art. I heard from Art that economic growth is great. It brings well-being, rises all boats. And I also heard from Bill that you can't stop growth. So my question is infinite economic growth possible? And if not, what happens then?
By infinite, I assume you mean an infinite time, or infinite percent, or what do you mean by infinite? Can we continue growing at 2-3% per year forever?
Continued expansion of the economy, yes.
Yes.
Well, I think there's no question about that, because what Josh and to a lesser extent Gary were saying is that we are producing stuff when we produce growth and GDP growth. We don't have to produce stuff at all. We can produce, I could read a poem to you, and you could pay me for that, and that would go into the GDP. So it doesn't have to be stuff, and that could, Robin Hanson, I don't know if any of you listen to Econ Talk, but Robin Hanson has an amazing podcast in which he talks about the singularities, the discontinuities in the history of growth, in which he says the first one was that human beings arrived at all. We all, are related to that first blue-green algae that popped up. Okay, and so after that, there was a long period in which there was almost no growth, doubling every 250,000 years. Then, by the time the end of the Pleistocene came, we had a doubling every 10,000 years, and now we have a doubling every 1,000 years. These are discontinuities, great discontinuities in the growth rate. So Robin believes that what's going to happen is that quite likely there will be another discontinuity in which GDP will double every 2 weeks. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. As long as we can get this this drag on GDP of the natural resource base out of the question, which it's going down and down and down, GDP could certainly double every 2 weeks.
Okay, let's have a short response from this side.
I would say that if you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. I would agree that if you completely dematerialize the economy, that growth could go on, GDP growth could go on forever. The other way, if it's based on throughput of resources, the only way that it can go on forever is if
Next question.
Oh, I would just like to say that even this idea that exponential growth, you know, if we have a 4% growth rate for 100 years, we increase the size of the economy like 128-fold. Let's say it's dematerialization, it's just an increase in pleasure. It's only like 250 years before our lives are unrelenting bliss. You know, this our satisfaction is so great. You know, wow.
Next question.
Thank you. This is directed to Bill and Art, primarily. There's no doubt that the third world is going to bear the brunt of whatever ecological ramifications we have from expanding markets. I mean, going back to your poetry example, even if you still read poetry, you'd have to bind it into a book, ship it, and that would still have some sort of, you know...
They're just electrons. There's a thing called a Kindle.
Well, my question is really, at what point does the ecological damage brought by climate change to the third world become so unbearable that it's not at all rectified by the economic growth that occurs within the same countries?
Well, the point is that as the economy grows and as poor countries get richer, it's a lot easier for them to deal with the consequences of whatever kind of problem you want to deal with. If it's Bangladesh, Bill's example, and the sea levels are rising, if they do, well, if Bangladesh is as rich as the United States is today, it really doesn't take a whole lot of your GDP, that is, your output, to build a seawall. You can deal with it if you're wealthy. If you're poor, you can't. Just as an example of today, think about the island of Hispaniola, right? Haiti's on one side, the Dominican Republic is on the other. One side is self-sufficient, they use all their own energy, it's Haiti. If you look at a satellite photo, it's brown because there's no trees. The Dominican Republic is wealthier, they can deal with environmental issues. Trees grow, they use oil, and that saves their, essentially, that saves their country's environment.
Any response?
Well, I think 100 million people in Bangladesh live in an area that's going to be flooded. That's a pretty big seawall, first of all. Second of all, it's not going to do anything about the change in the number of storms that are going to happen. So it would probably bankrupt the entire country because of the seawall level. So that is not a realistic solution.
One more quick comment on the notion of which just electrons. So actually, e-waste, electronic waste, has doubled in the last 5 years. So the corollary of Moore's law, that if computers become twice as good and cost half as much every 18 months, is that the amount of e-waste, essentially, the amount that it becomes obsolescent every 18 months. And if you look at the amount of energy consumed by the electronic sector, if you look at Apple lobbying to have cheaper coal-fired power plants, they all have their own generators. This is daily in the news of the incredible material output of energy and raw materials in the electronic sector. Those electrons aren't so cheap.
Next question.
My question is mainly for Josh and Gary, but to some extent to the debate as a whole. I was wondering why we were so quick to reduce the scope of the debate to just countries that have $10,000 GDP per person, or that is GDP, I guess. But I was just wondering, because people who live in those countries are most affected by how many resources their government has, and how much resources they have, because like Art was talking about, they often die otherwise. And the only way I can see this reducing overall misery is the concept that, well, if all the miserable people wind up dying, then there are less miserable people.
So that was the oversight. Yes, sir. Right, and actually, I did kind of do an oversight. I don't believe in ending growth in wealthy nations. I believe in dramatic degrowth, dramatically reducing the rate at which we extract resources from the nature and spew back waste. And what we need to do is, by consuming less in the wealthy nations, create that ecological space for the poorer nations to increase their consumption. They absolutely need to increase consumption in a lot of these poorer nations. If you look at Human Development Index, if you look at welfare, countries like Cuba, Costa Rica, Kerala, as Gary talked about, they have managed to achieve a fairly high Human Development Index with fairly low ecological impacts, and this is the direction we need to move in.
Response.
How are you going to stop Apple from producing more and growing faster? And if you do that, look what's going to happen historically in our country. From 1953 to 73, median family income doubled. During that time, People became richer. Look what happened. Segregation became unconstitutional. The right to vote was guaranteed. Racial discrimination was banned. Fair housing and unemployment opportunities legislation were enacted. Growth slowed down after that. We started to retrench. The EPA, by the way, was started during that period. If you look at the moral consequences of growth, as Ben Friedman from Harvard has, then you have to really wonder, if we get rid of that growth, what are we going to generate to? What kind of racial conflict are we going to go back to? What kind of problems are we going to have?
Next question.
So, I am Bangladeshi, and a lot was said about Bangladeshis in this debate. And I had two-part question for the opposing team. A lot was said on not my behalf, but Bengali's behalf. The first one is, what role do you think colonialism played in the state of Bangladesh currently, and whether there's any moral or ethical obligation by the US or the Western powers to acknowledge this? And the second thing is, you were talking about growth in Bangladesh isn't a good thing through free markets and free liberalization. And I've been there, and I've seen the TNCs that exploit the workers there, and only today a factory fell apart, killing 87 people there. And the level of absolute squalor there, and just trying to comprehend the fact that you're telling me that growth somehow goes to these people in slums, whereas when I've been there, it goes to a very small population, a percent of the population, and doesn't seem to be doing anything at all.
I have a debate workshop coming up in Bangladesh, so go ahead.
I don't want to deal with the issue of colonialism. I'm an economist and I'm a philosopher. But the squalor in the slums is awful until you think of what the alternative is. It's even worse living in the farms or in the rural areas. Slums are an improvement for people who move there. Nobody forces them to go there. They go there on their own, and they are better off. The Lower East Side in New York City at the turn of the century was awful. Slums all over the world are awful. A few years ago, some well-meaning NGOs, or an NGO, got a factory in Pakistan, I believe it was, that was hiring child labor to close down because they didn't want the children to work in that factory. And so the factory was closed down, the children were out of work, the families needed the money, and so what happened? Well, another NGO went and tried to find the children who had worked in that factory, and they found that many of them were engaged in child prostitution and other things. Think about the alternative. There's trade-offs. Slums are awful, but the alternative is worse.
Response?
I would certainly argue that we do have a huge obligation to these countries whose resources are being exploited. That sets them on a track that's much more difficult to overcome. And I think at this point, humanity is in it together. We can't say we're going to leave one country to be underdeveloped, another country developed. We've got to, we are in it together, and we have a moral obligation. I think the biggest issue right now is Bangladesh is a giant elephant. And it is one of the countries likely to suffer the worst from global climate change. They talked about choice. Economics all about choice and preferences. How do Bangladeshis show their preference for not being inundated 75% of their country where there's a flood? How do they show their preference? If you look at the FAO's predictions of impacts on agriculture, it's Africa, Bangladesh, India. These are the countries that will have dramatic reductions in agricultural output due to our choice to drive our SUVs, BMWs. How do they express their preferences for a stable climate, for no sea level rise? They can't do it through our economic system. And in a crowded country living in these slum conditions with great transportation systems, disease is a wonderful ecology for new diseases that can wipe out the planet. We're in this together. We can't leave them on their own. We have a moral obligation because of our past crimes and a practical obligation because we're in really deep problems if we have environmental refugees and new diseases emerging because we haven't addressed those problems.
The way we do this is not though by helping them by sending over a package well actually what we should do is reduce all of our import tariffs along with Europe and let these people join in the globalized market because that's the only possibility right now. There's no way that we're going to be able to send over packages of food or even iPods and help these people. This story about how the environment is going to come crashing down on our head that we've been treated to this afternoon is really old. It goes back to Thomas Malthus, Paul Ehrlich in 1968, who I guess is coming here. He said that the battle to feed humanity is over. This is right in 1968. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs that we embark on now. There's nothing we can do about it. They're all going to starve to death. We'll have 20 billion people on the face of the earth, we predicted. We haven't really got that many. At this time, here's what he writes, at this time, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. The reason why all of this scare stuff is not going to happen is because the proportion of natural resources in what we do goes down and down and down and down. And in the end, it's not going to be anything. It's going to be very, very small.
Okay, next question.
Well, first I'd like to thank you all for coming here today and putting on quite the show. And my question is, for the pro side, how would you apply the concept of resilience in growth economics from a complex systems perspective?
Oh, I guess that's me. It's very different from the way Josh and Gary would do it, I think. Although, working in this area?
I'm not, I don't models, but I understand complex systems, so kind of respond.
Okay, here's the idea. In complex systems, we set up little databases, little data structures called agents, and we let them interact with each other, and they do what they want to do on the basis of their own preferences. The outside observer, just like you're playing World of Warcraft 3, you can't influence whether the orcs or the humans win. You have to just watch it happen, okay? And then you try to figure out, you're smiling there, Adam, because you just written a senior thesis, an honors thesis on this exact topic. And so you can't tell these people that they would be better off if they turned left or went straight or got an extra AK-47 from the stash. They have to figure it out themselves. This is the perspective of economics. We don't tell them from a top-down point of view that you guys have got to do this or else you're going to suffer from some kind of ecological collapse that has not been observed. And even the people that know the most about this, the people who are making money 24/7 on whether, in fact, this is actually going to happen, traders in the market, they don't think it's going to happen. And as a result, the real prices of these resources have remained stable.
Any response?
I was just going to say, my understanding of complex systems is that they're characterized by both positive and negative feedback loops, which means that, for example, the negative feedback loop is a resource becomes more scarce, the price goes up, we demand less. The positive feedback loop is the resource becomes more scarce, the price goes up, speculators buy more, the price goes up more, speculators buy more, the price goes up more, we get bubbles and busts and emergent phenomena, surprises we didn't predict. A lot of the great science coming out of Amazon right now suggests that the forest recycles its own rainfall. And if we remove as little as 30% of the forest, instead of that rain falling on the forest, recycling back up into clouds, falling again, sustaining the forest, you remove the forest, it falls on the barren ground, goes into the rivers, is flushed from the system, and you get a positive feedback loop where fewer forests give you less rainfall, dry out the forest, give you less rainfall, dry out the forest. We get these types of runaway feedback loops. Climate change. A warming climate warms the tundra, emits more methane, warms the climate, warms the tundra. We get positive feedback loops leading to unexpected, unpredictable behavior. And the one thing about complex systems is we can't predict outcomes. We can build agent-based models. They're no better than what we put into them. So I argue that in the presence of complex systems, we want to keep we want to keep too much energy going into that system. One of the world's leaders in complex systems, of course, was Dana Meadows, who points out that if you have economic growth, you can increase that rate of economic growth in her model. You get to oscillations, bifurcations, wild chaos. That was my understanding of complex systems.
Okay, let's have the next question.
My question actually pertains to how you're saying in the past 100 years we're much better off than we used to be with the mortality rate and all the development and technology that we have. But from my understanding, all the less disease that we've had has come out of the investment in public sanitation and health, and the idea of understanding that we have had such pressing issues, especially in places like London and very tight slums that were, now are huge economic powers. There was a press and there's riots. Where I'm saying this in contemporary context is the idea of food riots and our broken food systems. And why is it that we have to wait till they're pressing so hard up against it, there's going to be riots and political uprising that threatens our global security through terrorism, whatever it may be. Sorry, I had to change my question because Moraz took it, so.
Go.
Yeah.
I just want to make one comment before, which is, the reason for the food riots recently was because we're converting grain into fuel instead of food, particularly corn, and that created a food riot in Mexico because the price of tortillas went up. And according to our economic people, everything is based on individual preferences, and if people want fuel instead of food, well, there's nothing we can do about that.
Well, I was almost going to say I agreed with you, Gary, and I agreed with most of you, but people's preferences had nothing to do with converting corn into fuel. It's because the government is forcing us to do that. That's our friends in Congress. There's absolutely nothing to do with personal preferences. So anybody who thinks that the government has all these great solutions and we need to do what Josh and Gary want us to do, and the way to do that is to get the government to do it. Remember, one of the biggest things the government has done to try to reduce our dependence on fossil fuel is requiring ethanol in cars, right? It's bad for the environment. It causes food riots. It leads to increased food prices in poor countries. It causes more starvation, and people are dying, and that's our policy. That's one of our major policies that was enacted within the last decade to deal with a problem of global warming. Isn't that wonderful? We've got to be very skeptical of any solution that doesn't involve personal preferences, because it actually makes things worse. And I think everyone's going to agree with that. The environmental community thinks that the ethanol program is just awful.
I don't know if I'm allowed to talk right now, but I would just like to say that we always have to remember that when we're talking about preferences, it's preferences this, preferences that. No, it's preferences weighted by purchasing power. So when the price of food, the price of wheat tripled in 2007, the price of rice and the price of corn doubled, what was the impact on you? How much less bread did you consume? You didn't even know what happened, because we spend such a tiny percentage of our income on food. Countries that consume over 3,000 calories per person per day saw no decrease in food consumption. Countries that consume under 2,000 calories per person per day saw dramatic decreases in food consumption. Because markets weight preferences by purchasing power, we don't care about the preferences of the poor at all. We let them starve. Those hungriest countries went hungrier. You didn't even notice the price of food, of wheat tripling.
I just want to say that for the first time today, I agree with Art about the government ethanol program. However, I don't blame the government. It was these giant agribusiness companies like Cargill and Archer Daniel Midlands who are getting huge subsidies, and it's totally corporate driven. It's not driven by the government.
I would just like to very briefly point out a theory called bootleggers and Baptists. And the Archer Daniel Midlands of the world are the bootleggers. They're going to make a profit by having Congress pass an ethanol. But the Baptists are the do-good environmental community who thought at the time that this was a wonderful idea. What could be better than using a renewable resource and putting it in your gas tank?
Nobody in